other state educational or state non-educational agencies, that it's streamlined certain processes. And on the other hand, on the other side of that is that students have lost significant control over being in control of their student data. So basic safeguards that FERPA allows is that student records will not be disclosed except for these initially crafted as narrowly tailored exemptions, that the student records could be disclosed, for example, in conjunction with receiving financial aid, that the student records could be disclosed to a teacher or another teacher who has a legitimate educational interest, that a student's information could be disclosed for research purposes, and this is without a student consent. But FERPA also grants students rights to access and amend their erroneous records. And what's the overall oversight mechanism is that federal funding could be removed from a school that does not comply with FERPA. But it's important to note that the Education Department would first need to give a school the opportunity to voluntarily comply with FERPA. And so you see where the leaves are falling there. If you as a school get a notice from the Education Department that you are violating FERPA, are you going to comply or are you going to not comply? You're going to comply. And for this reason, the Education Department has never lobbied any fines against schools. So right now, there's this movement to strengthen FERPA. And you say, well, why do you need FERPA strengthened? Do you have this law? Well, there are three distinct trends that are going on in the student privacy space. And it's these, what I would call as an asymmetry of increased student data collection, increased student data retention, increased student data dissemination, but with a decrease of the safeguards and accountability. So let's just briefly touch on the collection aspect, and this is showing you why Congress is ever interested in strengthening FERPA. So this is a famous quote for some of you in the education space. So in 2012, the CEO of Newton, which is an ed tech platform, described the company, Newton, as, we literally know everything about what you know and how you learn best, everything. We have 5 orders of magnitude more data about you than Google has. We literally have more data about our students than any company has about anybody else about anything, and it's not even close. Direct quote. So, and earlier this year, by some estimates, there are 161 ed tech investments around the world during the first half of 2015, totaling $1.59 billion. So here we're talking about countless data points, billions of dollars spent on data collection, both on information that a student may expect, like class attendance, whether she attended class that day, to information she may not expect, where she actually is in the school. Information that she may expect to be collected, whether she's passing a note in class. Well, I'm dating myself. People don't pass notes anymore. I guess they text or you're on your GChat. You may expect that a teacher or professor notices that you're doing that, but what you may not expect is that the teacher or the university has access to the contents of what you're sending over the school platform. You may expect that a university professor notices you goofing off in the back of the auditorium, but what you may not expect as a student is to actually be captured as part of a video recording. Second, is that as schools continue to contract with cloud-based services, and Kobe discussed this, there's literally no limit on how much information can be retained about students. And if you take it out of the ed tech platform and you move more to K through 12 statewide longitudinal databases, states are tracking students pre-K through 12 and into the workforce. So again, more student information is being retained. And lastly, when we're talking about dissemination, you have regulations that make it simply easier for schools to pass on student information. So this raises important privacy questions about who has access to this information. How long will this information be kept? Can students access their information, and not just access the information, but access really the decision-making behind it? As we talk about personalized learning, there's an issue about transparency. Will students be a part of the process more than just research subjects of schools and companies, but rather to see how the decisions are being made about their future. And it comes down to fairness, and it comes down to due process. And in the greater education policy space with student privacy, it comes to whether we are creating an environment of free inquiry for our students. Can our students innovate and explore in the classroom without all of their information being digitized and disseminated? So Congress, as they are looking to strengthen FERPA and other student privacy laws, are tackling some of these questions, some of the issues of dissemination, retention, not so much collection, but hopefully going forward, there will be efforts to minimize certain data collection.
Thanks, Sequoia. Is this working? Hello? Okay. So that's great. And I guess what the concern is with all these rewrites and all these proposed changes to student private legislation, would you say there is a problem? And I will open up to the rest of the panel. Can you give me some examples of what's going on which makes people think that there's this problem going on, that they need to rectify it?
Sure. So certainly a lot of the legislation right now focuses on marketing and companies accessing student data for one purpose and using it for marketing purposes. And there are, Epic filed an FTC complaint against a certain company that was collecting student information for scholarship purposes and disclosing this information to business partners. So that's one of the issues. Separate from the privacy issue, you have data security issues. The education space, like others, is routinely grappling with data breaches, massive data breaches. You're talking big universities, you're talking K-12 as well. Some of the legislation is focusing also on data security.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Oh, a quick question about biometrics. How does FERPA handle those?
So FERPA does define, the regulations do define biometrics as personally identifiable information, but one of the issues here is that you have more entities, some of companies that are not covered by FERPA. I mean, FERPA applies to state educational institutions and agencies that are receiving federal funding, and arguably there is some form of a reach to companies, but not strong enough. So you have a lot of schools that are contracting with private companies to collect biometric information, and that information is simply not protected by FERPA.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have any?
Sure. I guess I similar to Clea's point, I approach this somewhat different, though, in that there is certainly kind of an asymmetry between the protections that FERPA provides and the way that FERPA was built on an idea of knowledge, and the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act, which is really the FTC in governing private companies, which is really built on the idea of power and consent. So what you have in schools is this kind of union now of public entities paying a lot of money to private companies, and because the laws are really built on a very different set of mechanisms and fundamental principles, there's a huge disconnect and a really kind of scary space for a lot of parents that they don't understand that schools are well within their FERPA rights to be contracting with these private companies under legitimate educational interest, and we can debate exactly what that broad category means. That's fine, but that is a clause that is within FERPA and is well kind of documented. It's large enough to drive a proverbial school bus through what's an educational interest on. And so schools are well within their right, and it's been kind of vetted by legal counsel that, yes, we can make these contracts as a school system. But in the private space, there is an idea of consent, and that parents have the right to kind of consent to this certain information collection, especially of children under a certain age. So you have this disconnect when schools are contracting so frequently for the very kind of essence of public schooling, teaching, learning, classroom management, accountability to these private companies. So this is the space, I think, where I actually just kind of met with Kathleen Stiles, the Chief Privacy Officer, last week at the Department of Ed, saying, you know, what I think we really need to do is forget FERPA, COPPA as individual entities and really have some sort of mechanism for saying how are these two interacting together in the educational space, and what does that mean? Where are the gaps? Where are the ways that we need to bring these two laws closer together? Because education now is such a public-private partnership that it's really hard to tease apart where it's a public school, where it's a private entity, where is the data being shared. And it takes a really quite robust, legal policy team at a school system to hold a lot of these private companies accountable through MOUs and through data sharing agreements, especially in the world of all this freeware. So it's certainly complex, and the way the two laws are set on different fundamental principles makes for a lot of kind of transparency issues with parents.
If I could just add something. The issue really, to me, and I think many would agree with this, with FERPA is that FERPA was not a law designed for today's world. It was a law, it was a privacy law that was designed at a time when computers were not, they were around, but they really weren't being used to the degree that they're being used today. Really the best example, it's not perfect, but if you look at what's happened in healthcare, and people complain a lot about different things in healthcare, but one thing that in healthcare they're doing a lot better, not perfectly, but better, is how they're protecting patient confidentiality and patient records. And one of the reasons is that their version of FERPA, which is called HIPAA, the Health Insurance, I'm going to mess up the name, but anyway, it's essentially the FERPA version of healthcare privacy law, but it is meant for a world in which information is shared electronically. And what it does is it both protects confidentiality and privacy, but also allows doctors and nurses who are trying to take care of a patient to be able to talk and communicate with each other in a way that helps that patient. Much like students need their teacher and their school counselor and their parent to be able to talk with each other about where a student is. And that's kind of a simplified way of looking at it, but that sort of is where I see FERPA being incredibly deficient. And actually, under FERPA, the way I read it, you really can't share information outside of that legitimate educational purpose. Now, Teddy's right. What does that mean exactly? That's where you run into issues. But when I hear a company selling student data, I can assure you that that's not legal. But they may be getting away with it because the current law is lacking teeth. And the other thing that's occurring that's even a bigger policy area is that we're asking teachers and school counselors and principals to follow all these privacy laws, and they're not adequately trained to do it. They don't know what the laws are. They don't have the tools they need. They don't have training on when they are violating a student's privacy. And so those are some of the underlying issues that really need to be addressed.
Thanks, Chip. Now that we just thoroughly scared you with the laws, why don't we shift a little bit over to what schools are actually doing with student data privacy. Teddy, I know you with Howard County Schools, you're working with a lot with big data and using algorithms kind of formulate predictions on what students will do and how they'll end up performing in classes. I know before you get into the K-12, a lot of the colleges are actually using things like predictive analytics to decide, what are you likely to complete school? Are you, based on whether you're going to your study halls, whether you're going to participate in outside things? How are you in the K through 12 aspect using algorithms and these predictions to really inform your decisions?
So I guess I'll give you a story. There's a guidance counselor software package that some of you may know about that really kind of predicts where students, the right colleges that they should be applying to, and it does all sorts of statistical analysis, scatter plot things, and says, here's the colleges you should be, kids like you will do well here, right? And so from the kind of privacy perspective, on a somewhat philosophical level, I've entered into a number of discussions with the guidance counseling team about what that actually means. To what extent are those predictive mechanisms limiting kids' choices? What if a kid says, I want to try to be that outlier. I don't care what this scatter plot says about where I should be going to school and where kids are like me. What if I want to take a risk and try to apply for something? So in the day-to-day workings, I know this is one of the conversations we have often between the accountability and the privacy and the data teams are, where is that balance between efficiency and use of resources and really tailoring a limited set of resources to the best educational outcomes and making sure that those resources are best used, On the balance of that, though, is to what extent are these tools limiting kids' abilities to take risks, to make choices, to try to take a class that may be above their level, to be that kid who would rather get a C in a harder class than necessarily be the A in a lower class, or apply for something that might not be, within the normal range of that. So, and I know within the school system, my job is relatively new. There's not many privacy officers in a K-12 LEA, so part of what I'm doing is really kind of acting as the voice of these things across many different sectors within the school system and trying to get people to think about how they're using data, what that might actually mean, how it's limiting choices for kids, and how, even though efficiency and these things are important, if we don't have a mind for allowing kids to flourish and risk and experiment, then we're really kind of undermining part of what we should be doing as a school system.
And Teddy, who's making these decisions based on the algorithms? And is there any kind of bias that can actually be put into the algorithm that can say, if you're a kid from a lower income, mostly minority neighborhood, maybe you should be doing a trade rather than going to college? Is there something like that can be done in these algorithms that can kind of limit that choice?
Sure. I mean, this is a lot of the work that we see in statistics and theoretical analysis of these things, that, a big concern with how we're creating these mechanisms is the biases that we're embedding in them, and to what extent those. So with Howard County, it's not like we write our own, we're a school system that has limited resources. We don't write our own. We don't have, we're not that sophisticated, but we certainly are using software and using other companies that are doing some of these things in data warehouses. And so part of what we are trying to do is make sure that when we are asking these companies to perform certain analytics for us, that we are well aware of the inputs and outputs and how those are affecting certain decisions. And for us, it's really using that data point as only one of many decisions, one of many factors into making that decision. So if the data points to something a class a student might take, a path through school, an intervention that might be necessary, that is really only one piece of a much larger decision that includes teachers and parents and personal observations and anecdotes and all those other things we know as educators are equally important to some score.
Anyone have any comments they want to add to that? Well, we can actually, we can talk a little bit more about algorithms in a second, but I also want to give Chip a little time to talk about, how you're using this data that's being collected and how you're tailoring that information to individual students and doing the personalized learning.
Sure. So a couple weeks ago, a friend of mine asked what I had done at work that day, and I said, oh, it was a really interesting day. I spent an hour and a half talking with a couple colleagues about what the word personalized means. And she said, did you think about looking it up in a dictionary? Very good point, and it kind of a silly argument to someone not involved in education. But actually, that is a really big debate in education, is what do we mean when we talk about personalized learning? So this is my take on what personalized learning means and why data is important. So think about it like this. Over time, we've had four models essentially in teaching. The old model, where you think about the one-room schoolhouse where the teacher gets up in front of the room, lectures, everyone does the same thing, they have the same books, they're on the same time schedule. So I call that traditional. Then in the 70s, teachers, actually probably before that, but at some point teachers started getting a little more power and ability to separate some students out and to differentiate in learning. So you may have a class of 20 kids and there's 2 or 3 groups in different stages of math. Some may even be using a different textbook. That's differentiated learning, and there have been some favorable results from that. Take it a step further, and you have individualized learning. This is where it gets confusing with personalized learning. Individualized learning is where you can tailor lessons to a specific individual student. It's sort of a step beyond differentiation. It's very often associated with an IEP, for those of you that are familiar with that. IEPs are something actually mandated for certain students in law. It's an actual plan, an individual student's plan that has to be followed. And I think they're great overall. Sometimes they're not, though, depending on how they're being implemented and in what way. And they also tend to be very rigid and not flexible, or at least not flexible enough. But the goal behind them is great. It's to get this particular student to the point they need to get to succeed. So personalized learning, to me, is the next step. The first three are kind of centered around the teacher and how the teacher is figuring out how to run the classroom. Personalized learning, the teacher's equally as important, but the learning is more centered around each individual student. So not only can you tailor education to them and differentiate it by putting them in certain groups, but they have actual more ownership of what they're doing. So it combines things like their interests, things they want to do. It actually avoids, and I think avoids the sort of the tracking a student, well, he's good at this and not good at this, so we're going to push them in this direction. With personalized learning, it takes those things into consideration, but it also takes into consideration what that student might ultimately want to do and what the best path forward is to get them to that goal. And it's mastery-based, it's competency-based. In other words, students aren't being drug along through a particular unit based on how long they've worked on it if they're not ready. You know, if you don't know how to do multiplication, you can't do long division. And right now, in most of our school system, you get to a certain point where you either pass it or you don't, but it's time to move on. So personalized learning it's got more freedom and more flexibility in learning. Now here's why data is so important. To be able to do that, to offer that kind of educational experience at scale, barring you having your own personal tutor, technology can help make that happen. It's not by itself the game changer, but all of a sudden, if you walk into a school, a classroom where a teacher is utilizing a personalized learning system, they don't necessarily have the old, well, here's my, here's our class schedule, our lesson plan for the next 2 weeks. Their lesson plan can change daily, and it can change daily for each individual student or the class as a whole, depending on how each student is doing. And that's a combination of looking at digital textbooks, looking at learning games, and actually sitting down with students and trying to figure out where they are. So when I talk about personalized learning, that's really what I'm talking about. So data really does become incredibly, incredibly important to be able to make that happen. Now, to do that, we have to make sure it's safe. People that aren't involved directly in that student's learning, which would be the teacher, the parent, the student themselves, and one or two others in a school, the principal, potentially the school counselor. Beyond that, who else needs to see that information? And not many. And that's where schools need help. They need better systems, better data systems, safer data systems. They need good, strong policies, privacy policies that are transparent and easy for parents to understand. And they need to do what Howard's doing, if they can, and that's to have actually a chief privacy officer, someone who understands the issues. And I'm a lawyer, and lawyers, I think we're all great, but lawyers are not necessarily experts in privacy law. So it isn't even necessarily that school district attorney if they have one. But there's a lot of issues associated with that. There are many school districts that might have 50 kids in the whole district. So how does a district like that have a chief privacy officer? And that's where we do need real world solutions to figure out how to do that. Are there smaller districts working together? Is there a statewide chief privacy officer, which we would advocate that every state needs as a minimum? And these are just some of the things to think about as we're going forward. But when done right, personalized learning can be a really unbelievable way to change how a student learns if it's high quality, and of course if that student is being protected as they should.
You want to add?
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about personalized learning. Don't we want to help people learn how to work together? Say Kobe has his track, I've got my track. Eventually we've got to work together on some project in the real world. So I'm a little worried along those lines. And you might say, well, isn't the natural next leap combining people? As soon as you've combined Kobe and myself on a project, and you've chosen us to be in that project, that's an educational project, you're revealing what individuals you're coupling. Say all the blacks are coupled together in the same projects, and the Latinos and all of that. So again, are you considering the whole notion of extending personalized learning to the collaborative or group component? And if so, what dangers would you run into?
Well, obviously, if grouping people based on their ethnicity, and that's the only way you're putting them together, that's not what I'm talking about at all. However, what you are talking about, I think, in terms of working small groups of people working together, is project-based learning, which is absolutely one of the key models in personalized learning. I visited a high school in Cleveland almost 4 years ago now. It was a high school in which they were using project-based learning They were combining, students would be in multiple subjects. You'd have an algebra and a chemistry class working together, or an algebra, chemistry, and social studies class working together, and students were grouped based on various reasons. Typically, though, they actually tried to make the groups even in terms of ability, so that students could learn from each other. And so in a true personalized learning system, collaboration and working together is one of the most important things you can get out of it. It's that socialization that can happen, and all of a sudden, students are learning about, well, why are cell phones important and where do they come from? Well, they're learning how a cell phone is made, how it's engineered and manufactured, what chemicals and minerals are needed to produce it, what are the societal effects of cell phones or not having a cell phone, and in those countries where they are producing the minerals or produce them, what about child labor? What about environmental issues? And so all of a sudden, you're taking all of this knowledge in these various content areas and applying them in a real-world situation and helping students learn to think critically. So actually, I would say that getting it sort of your overall base really is what personalized learning should be. Yeah. But you do bring up a point, I think, that needs considered.
So I thank you very much, Teddy. So one of the issues I recognize limiting the purposes or those to which the information is disseminated, like it's limiting who has access to the information. But the personalized learning context also raises important issues about limiting some of the data collection, like how much information is enough, because oftentimes it opens the door to say, well, if this certain student likes this color and this is her interest and her parents are from this area and her parents do this and that there's this idea that that all of those should factor into how a student is taught. And there are big questions in this space about the efficacy of all of the data collection. And it's important, at least from a student privacy context, to always remember that correlate, not saying that you're saying this, but in the broader context, there's this false notion, it feels oftentimes, that correlation is causation, that, if we gather all of this data on students and we find some type of link, it's because the student goes to bed at this time that she learns a certain subject better. And so that there needs to be more research into the efficacies of big data in the school context. And what's also very important, in addition to the transparency, it's very helpful for the parents to know what's going on, but above all, accountability. If you're a parent and you read a privacy policy and the company says or school says they will not do XYZ with your information, and they do, what's your recourse? What do you do now if the information either wasn't safeguarded, it wasn't kept in a secure manner, as Teddy was saying, or if it was actually, for 1 year they decided to use it in one context and said, actually, we're sitting on a gold mine here, we want to use it in a different way. So as Congress continues to look at solutions and as states continue to push this envelope forward, data collection, the scale of data collection is an issue that must be confronted, as well as meaningful accountability to students and parents in the K-12 context, but as well as to students, all students.
Wayne, I guess if I put on my kind of philosopher of education hat, which I've done for many years teaching philosophy of education, I guess with the personalized learning and having been a student and a teacher, and I've taught in K-12 in East LA for many years, taught high school English, and part of my concern with, and this is where I think privacy can be this lens to really examine bigger issues, on to what extent does personalized learning, while it can create a great benefit if used well and used for a few minutes a day, for a small point in time, and if we overuse these things and if we rely too much on data, we're really narrowing the scope of education. We're taking what has been a long history in this country of using education to create robust democratic citizens, to be, as Jefferson said, to find the gems in the rubble and to really elevate people through a robust public education. And if that gets narrowed to this point of where we're really going to microanalyze every kid's little ability to play a math game and then move the needle ever so slightly to better algebra scores, the philosophy person in me says, who cares? if that kid cannot participate and have a conversation in a democratic society and have his voice or her voice heard and communicate with others. So as much as I am a proponent of helping each kid through some sort of individualized or personalized learning, I think that the kind of sociology of privacy helps us imagine what this is doing in terms of narrowing the scope of education. And so as much as the data security, and I totally agree that if we're going to kind of analyze when a kid logs on to the learning management system, and is that kid on from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m., and what might that mean about a kid's score? Maybe it means she was babysitting her little siblings and got them to do their homework first and then couldn't log on to her stuff until midnight, until they're sharing one computer as a family. And I taught kids who shared one computer. And so did the fact that my student who was a senior log on at midnight mean that she was a derelict student? Maybe. Maybe it meant she got all of her younger siblings through their classes first and then was the one who got the computer latest at night. And so I do, have a concern if we're just amassing a ton of data on students and what that means when they get to school the next day versus really thinking about this as, I think you're a proponent of using it as a tool, right? One of many different mechanisms. And if used well, it's a really powerful mechanism. If it's used only, then I think it's a very limiting mechanism. And so I think that's one of the ways that kind of privacy helps us unearth some of these kind of deeper rooted issues within this space.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with that. And let me just make it clear that one of the great things about having data is, I mentioned a school I had visited, was that teacher was able to sit down and spend a lot more individual time with each student, simply because she did have a little bit of data to look at that she wouldn't have normally had, beyond a homework assignment and a letter grade and a standardized test score, which in one sense is kind of what we see in many places now. This is, if used well, once again, it's just a tool, but if used correctly, the way it's supposed to be used, that teacher, rather than teaching to a test and, we're 9 weeks down the road, we're a semester down the road, or a year down the road, is they're, in one sense, they're assessing that student all the time and how they're doing. And that's where this can be a great, wonderful, healthy thing. But once again, it's how much data, what kind of data, and are we going, I think, digging too far? There's certainly, there's a limit. I think that's absolutely right to how far we go.
Thanks, Chip. And you're all right. And I think that is, it is a question, it's a balancing act. But I want to make sure we discuss all the educational topics. And it's funny, we're always very concerned about the K through 12 question and the debate. But somehow kids magically turn into adults at 18, and we forget about a lot of the privacy rights that are going on in higher education. And a lot of the higher education, surveillance and monitoring that's going on is new, but we need to make sure we're cognizant of it, because it can become another situation like K through 12, where we were kind of caught off guard because in Bloom happened, and then we kind of reacted rather than being proactive with a lot of the things that we're doing. So I want to shift it over to Joanne and talk about some of the surveillance that's going on in schools, as well as schools of higher education, as well as some of the issues of third-party companies doing surveillance on students.
Quick joke to move us into higher education mode. This is a classroom out of the 1960s. Think Paper Chase. Think Professor Kingsfield, granted, Netflix. We've got a high-stakes exam going. Students scribbling in their blue books. Okay. Professor says, "Time's up." The students all race to the front, hand in their blue books, except for one student. Professor Kingsfield says, "Please hand in that student that blue book now, or you'll get an F for the exam." The student refuses to do it. Professor Kingsfield says, "Forget it. You fail. That's it." Student walks up to Professor Kingsfield and says, "Do you know who I am?" Professor Kingsfield, with his arrogance, says, "No." Student says, "Great." Puts his copybook into the pile and runs out. Okay, that's our problem in higher education, okay, in a nutshell. And gosh, if I were, I didn't want to say this, but if I were in my 20s right now, I would love to tackle the problem of how to get this whole problem of online education monitoring solved. in a humane way and all of that. What's happening now? There are a bevy of solutions to online testing. And those of you who are in higher education right now, you know the problems we're dealing with. Faculty absolutely hate cheaters. They hate plagiarism. And we're talking about surveillance and professors possibly doing something about surveillance. I would even like them to do something about due process and all of that when the supposed cheaters get caught. It's not pretty when students are caught cheating. So again, we're dealing with a number of interests here. Of course, we're talking the general theme of third parties. We've got the ProctorU, about a couple of dozen more companies, some of which will be eventually bought by larger organizations to great profit for the originators of those companies, of course. But again, the technical problems are interesting. What biometrics do you choose, et cetera? The United States Department of Education wants to know that the people who are taking online courses and paying thousands and thousands of dollars for those courses are indeed the individuals that they claim to be. It's easy to do some swapping along those lines. Remember the Professor Kingsfield situation. And also, administrators would like to know, to some extent, what's going on in classrooms along this line. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the online testing problem. I'll work very quickly. I know we've got a time limitation. And of course, some of the other issues concerning the surveillance of students and also faculty. Okay, this is the beginning of surveillance along those lines. So what kind of biometrics are taken by the companies that are tracking individuals' test taking? The knuckle measurements, yes indeed, as well as facial measurements, biometrics are taken, but also systematic cheating movements. And we're dealing with all sorts of cultural expectations, cultural issues that terrific last panel by Dr. Jared Wall brought up those issues. Is an individual who looks down a lot, cheating. And if you're not capturing the fact that people in some racial or ethnic groups look down a lot, you will be false identifying a number of individuals, false positives, who do not have cheating in their agendas, et cetera. The person who's taking, we had the example of the individual who's doing that exam at 1 to 3 o'clock in the morning and all of that because there's only one computer available. What if her kid wakes up, walks behind her and says, "Mommy," or something like that? That is tracked, honestly. That is tracked by some of the testing services out there. And a little notation is made. This is a possible cheating attempt. If you look at a cell phone, maybe waiting for an important call, this is a possible cheating attempt. Some poor overworked professor, okay, is going to have to look at all these and sort them out. Not a pretty situation along those lines. And of course, the issues only accumulate. What if we do acquire a list of people who are potential cheaters? Do we want a cheaters list? Some companies would like to hire from that list. It might be a very pricey list. Some companies, not so much. Do we want people to live with that onus, the cheaters list? Now, we were talking about privacy policies. ProctorTrack has one that allows it to hand over material to third parties. So we're not only talking about a third party to another party. We're not only talking about third parties, but fourth parties, and fifth parties, all of which will have to be mapped somehow. Especially, this is all especially important if we get to those cheaters profiles. So Rutgers had a run-in because of some very good student reporting along these lines that eventually got to the New York Times, some very brave students along those lines. It created the opportunity for in-person test for $40. For $40, you could buy your freedom from the testing eye along those lines, which of course offended some students. And of course, there's all the issues with disability, and I hope to connect with a few of you with whom I connected previously about disability issues. Huge issues about individuals who have anxiety. Will this add to their anxiety, et cetera, et cetera? So lots of issues. The big one, should universities declare when they are making you pay for your tuition? Yeah, we're going to test you. We're going to do such and so with your data. Your data will be erased or not after a certain amount of time. These are the parties we're working from. Is that going to be in your awareness when you sign that check for your tuition? Or will it be buried maybe at the bottom of some syllabus somewhere? And we're talking all schools that are doing this. We're talking about higher education schools across the board because cheating is such a huge issue along those lines. And yes, five minutes. Okay. Scrubbing Twitter for ACT, SAT, GRE questions and all that. Another huge issue that's emerging in terms of the kind of privacy students have. Do we want these educational testing services, which of course are huge business, to be scrubbing our students' data, et cetera? But faculty and staff monitoring, here's where the fun begins. There's all sorts of classroom monitoring when we think of our online classes, what words we use, what can be taken out of context. I love the kind of monitoring, though, that my students at UW-Whitewater are putting into place, cell phone cameras in the classroom and all of that. Some of little bits of video that land up on Fox News, I kid you not. So lots of interesting ways that faculty and staff can be monitored as well. But the important thing is that we begin to realize that we need to be humane along these lines. We need to understand what the relationships are in higher education. It's all about personal relationships. We need to respect the fact that it's the faculty member and the student. However we do that, and I'm not saying we can't reproduce those relationships online, but we need to be careful about the ways that these third-party testing services could be subverting those relationships. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And if you want more, before I go to questions, if you want more information about FERPA or COPPA or any of the other student privacy issues, there are resources available. Future Privacy Forum, we offer FERPA Sherpa website, which pretty much breaks it down in different categories for vendors, teachers, parents. We also have the Parents Guide to Student Data Privacy, which kind of gives a nice overview of the issues of FERPA and what they should know. We're going to come out with a teacher's guide, an educator's guide later this year. And that's enough of my shameless plugs. Anyone else want to do a shameless plug?
Epic.org for
Epic.org.
all of your student privacy. We also keep a robust archive of our past work and current developments on the state front, as well as various lawsuits or complaints or just issues emerging, student privacy issues, epic.org.
You can just look me up on LinkedIn if you want.
He has like 8 jobs. It's
Pick
hard
one,
to
say
find.
hi.
And we've got, if you go to the Alliance website, we have a couple very short papers, one on data in general, how education data is used at the school, district, state, and federal level. It's about 2.5 pages long, and we have a similar one on FERPA that just it lays out, not nearly as well as Kalia did, but it lays out just the basics of what it is. If you just want to look at something real simple, feel free to go to our website and take a look at that.
And I just have one shameless plug. I've written a number of articles on gaming academia, how students and faculty are gaming the system in terms of some of these elements. And also, I just published an article as well on gaming Google, how we subvert Google in so many different ways. So gaming and Oravik will get all of that.
Great. Now that we paid for our panel, we'll take some questions. I got one over here, and then I'll get to you two.
Thank you. Hi, I had a question about the concept of consent in an education environment. A couple of people have spoken about the student consenting to a class, or maybe when you sign your tuition check for higher education. It seems to me that at least for kids, the consent is almost, it's not up to them, right? We don't have good legal frameworks for consent for minors. The kid in the classroom is asked, hey, do you consent to this? And it's like, if they say no, what happens? What are the consequences? And so I wanted to know if people have an answer for how you approach consent in a context where you're dealing with minors who have a difficulty legally giving consent. And given that context, what do you see as the consequences for the normalization of intense surveillance, right? We're talking here about how do we give these kids a great education. We know this is for their good, or we hope this is for their good. But the result is that they come out of schooling with a data trail that's a mile long and an expectation that their supervisors will heavily surveil them. So even if they didn't have consent, going forward, they now have 12 years of experience being coerced basically into these systems. So how do we even if the goal is to improve education, how do we deal with these follow-on consequences based on the difficulties with consent?
Just a quick notion about consent. A lot of the consent literature in my area has been built upon the Turnitin cases, and Turnitin has been able to support itself and fight all these legal challenges and all of that through the years, and it's become the default. If you take certain classes, even in my institution, your papers are read in to Turnitin. The students lose copyright. No one can seem to defeat that claim that Turnitin has, that it's a perfectly legal thing, and the consent has somehow been wrought through the educational context.
So I think from the K-12 space, in terms of, you kind of have two issues you're grappling with. One, in terms of consent and kids, especially under 13. And we handle that in our school system two ways. One, if it's an enterprise level system that we have a contract with that we then consider as part of our FERPA, we don't really ask for consent to use our learning management system or our student information system. We pay lots of money, have legal teams review the contracts. There's 20 pages of data agreements and all sorts of protections. The issue are all the freeware that teachers can use. And so the way we handle that within our small little world in between Baltimore and DC is that we have a list of authorized programs that we allow teachers to use, and then we ask parents to provide their consent to those programs, so that we are informing our parents and saying, here, your students in this school uses these 10, 12 sorts of software or cloud-based programs, and so parents kind of sign a form that says, yes, we consent to allow you to use these, and we then have conversations around what that means. In terms of the second question, the surveillance state, the long trail of data around kids, to me, this is where the privacy advocates really have to step up and say, how much is our job really protecting the dignity of kids and the ability to make mistakes, to be creative, to take risks, and not have that trail follow them, right? If the data is used for a particular class, for a particular tool in that moment, can we put enough protections in place that says that's it? We've paid for your service, you've used the data, you've given us our feedback, and then that's now ours and we're done. And that's where the kind of FERPA issue comes in terms of this being really technically students' and parents' data that schools are the stewards of for a time being. And that's a shift, I think, in thinking that really needs to be made more aware at the ground level.
We have time for one more very brief question, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead. If you have a loud enough voice, you can just say it.
Just for the webcam.
Yeah, I understand.
What are the rules governing sharing information about students with law enforcement? One of the big issues that has sort of landed on my plate recently is the idea of using tracking software to identify students who may be radicalized. So this is, there are 5 counties, they're running something called Impero, and it's supposed to identify potential radicalization. What are the rules? Fourth Amendment?
Excellent question.
Excellent question.
We had-
I'll take that softball question. No. If we're looking at FERPA as a framework, FERPA has a discrete exception for what's called education records. And that education records under FERPA, they do not include records that are compiled by the law enforcement unit of a school for law enforcement purposes. So in that sense, under FERPA, those records aren't protected. There aren't any types of limits to which a school could further disclose that information. From a Fourth Amendment context, and as well as a First Amendment, because you have a lot of law enforcement that are just looking on social media and impacting students' rights. From a privacy standpoint, you would need a warrant to perform any of those types of searches. And also some of the issues that are being raised, I know in DC, local public schools have a relationship by which their video feeds in the schools, they call it sharing, but disclosing that information with the local police department. So you have to look at the broader context of how we or how schools, rather, and who are collecting this information are criminalizing students, and how this facilitates school-to-prison pipelines and other issues like that. So there have to be accountability mechanisms. There has to be some type of legal process. A warrant is required to perform any of these types of searches in schools and elsewhere.
And I think that's real quick.
It's required to coerce
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
If education records, which is a film of a kid in a classroom, are turned over to law enforcement, then they lose all the FERPA limitations. That means the student has an absolute right to see the data, that it isn't confidential law enforcement. I mean, FERPA sets up this discrete thing where if it's a law enforcement record and it never is shared with the education
Correct.
officials, then it's treated the way law enforcement records are generally. But in a situation where they take an education record and turn it over to law enforcement, then FERPA says the parent and the child have an absolute right to see that record, and that's something law enforcement generally isn't excited about.
That was awesome. So I'd like to thank the panel for being on this, and I hopefully we can do it in the future. And thank you very much. If there's any other questions, please see us afterwards. Thank you.